Hello, from the CTS Lab Research Group at FLACSO Ecuador in Quito. Gaudiz Laxuri is my name, your podcast presenter, and I'm a huge fan of discourses in science and technology studies. From July 1st to the 5th, 2019, the first Science and Technology Summer School was held at FLACSO Ecuador, where I hesitate to call them lectures, but rather discussions of ideas by some of the great thinkers of science and technology studies. Professors Langdon Winner, Michael Bennett, and Adrian Smith led the discussions during the summer school. Professor of Technology and Society from the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, Adrian Smith, joins us now. Good day, Adrian. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Thanks for coming in. Now, you dive straight into the pool of science and technology studies. What are your thoughts on the promotion of science and technology studies from the UK towards Latin America and vice versa?
To be frank, I was really privileged and felt honoured to be invited to come over here and participate in the summer school, and I was really excited to have the chance to learn how science and technology studies is developing here in Ecuador, and just trying to understand a little bit about some of the challenges and possibilities and the role that science, technology and innovation plays in Ecuadorian society and in the wider region as well. But I was also a bit nervous because obviously this is a country I know very little about, keen to learn, but I was wondering to what extent, if you like, what I've learned about science technology studies and how I've used it in the UK, in Europe, in collaboration with researchers in other countries like Argentina and India, just how that might kind of resonate or not with people here. And during the course of this week of the summer school, I've really appreciated, so the spirit I kind of came to this was inspired a bit by kind of Boaventura Sousa de Santos' work on, he wrote a book called Epistemologia del Sur, and the idea of opening up contact zones, if you like, where you can have a dialogue between different ways of knowing and understanding the world, understanding each other's sort of starting assumptions and experiences. And that reassured me, if you like. So, I can come with some examples of studies I've done in Spain and in the UK, and
Can you expand a little on the research, at least a little blurb or synopsis of your last research project, what you presented here?
So, what did I bring? Yeah, that's the question. So, yesterday I brought two examples from research projects. I've been doing a variety of research and looking at many sort of case studies, if you like, which is my main method of working. And I brought two, one that I did about 5 years ago and one that I finished about a year ago. And so the first one introduced was basically a kind of citizen science project that was set up and run in Barcelona, which was part of a wider project where, with colleagues in Europe, with a collaborative project where we've been looking at the knowledge politics of smart urbanism. And we've been looking at a number of cities, and I had the good fortune to look at the knowledge politics of smart urbanism in Barcelona and how city-level policies towards smart cities has changed with shifts in administration, how really interesting ideas around, if you like, how concerns and the critique against smart cities as a kind of very technocratic exercise that actually diminishes. Well, what we were interested in with the project was taking on board the critique of smart cities. Smart cities as a discourse, if you like, or even as an agenda, brings a particular way of looking at the city, and understanding the city and intervening in the city, using technology like sensors, big data, interlinked sort of operating platforms, and actually trying to view the city as a variety of systems, and through partnerships between city authorities and corporate technology providers. The idea is you can get real-time understandings of what's going on in the city, make make interventions at appropriate moments in suitable ways, and improve the efficiency of the city.
Okay, well,
But also, and then alongside that, obviously, it's no small part of it is it's also an opportunity to sell a lot of technology and create new markets for digital technologies in these new urban settings. Now, that's a particular way of going about governing urban processes, urban developments.
Right.
Yeah. And what we're interested in is if it's a particular way of knowing the city. What kinds of other ways of knowing the city does that exclude?
right.
Okay, and then also, so there's that kind of sort of knowledge politics, but there's also other things going on in cities like Barcelona. I think in many cities around the world, which is alongside the, if you like, the city authority, corporate, kind of quite technocratic approach to using these technologies, and also alongside, if you like, really strong criticisms, I think quite deserved criticisms of this approach. There are, particularly in terms of the democratic content of doing this way of governing cities, okay? But then there's these intriguing initiatives dotted around where groups of neighbours and maybe technology activists, particularly in a sort of technopolitics sort of orientation, are appropriating some of the similar, not the same, but similar digital technologies around sensors, computation, web platforms, to create their own devices for knowing their bits of the city, and ostensibly, they claim in a sort of participatory way, trying to use technologies to improve, if you like, or have a better voice in the development of their cities. So the case study I brought from Barcelona was very interesting project in which some technology activists who developed this thing called the Smart Citizen Kit, a sort of quite sort of rudimentary environmental monitoring kit, actually, that had problems in its conception, but then was sort of reoriented and shifted so that, and by working with some community, some neighbours around a square in Barcelona, they could do a noise monitoring campaign to address a noise problem that the residents had been, suffering from, if you like, or living with in the square for many, many years. And so we talked about that yesterday.
Right.
We talked about what roles does this kind of participatory community form of developing the noise monitoring platform tailored to that square. How did it help in the formation of a collective of people who had who'd codified what they already knew about the square? It's very noisy and it's a nuisance to them, and they codified that into some, into data, into some form that the authorities would recognise.
Well, this is a perfect segue to the following question. While reviewing the Smart Cities website, it appears to only show artifacts, but there's no information on the functioning of the community and biological empowerment. So there's a lack of data. So it appears that these projects are socialized, the moment of sharing the information, and that it places a more emphasis on the technology. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think this is where science and technology studies got an awful lot to contribute, and to get it needs to get involved in these sorts of projects and point out that it's not the technologies that solve these problems; it's the people behind the technologies and the way that they're designed and organised and put into use actually shape the kind of what happens, if you like, and who's included and who's excluded. And as I was saying, with the way we were trying to enter into that smart urbanism project, particular ways of knowing the city, perhaps certain voices get excluded. If it's all about data, then what about non-codified ways of knowing the city? What about sort of neighbourhood level, face-to-face meetings as ways of arriving at decisions about what's going on in the city? What about other forms of more democratic ways of engaging in the city? And then there's also, with science and technology studies, look where we think about how technologies evolve in societies and what have you. I mean, I wonder, this is not something I've followed up really, but if city authorities and their corporate partners are just sort of putting in sensors and operating systems across the entire urban fabric, then, I don't know, quite apart from some of the darker sides about that could actually turn into quite an authoritative surveillance way of governing the city. You know, I mean, we're saying, oh, it's all efficient, but there's a dark side to this. But also, given that we're concerned about things like sustainable development, right. And there's ideas about promoting more kind of adaptable artifacts, longer-lived things, then if you're putting in digital technologies that might have a life cycle of 5 years or something, or software that needs constant updating, that's driven by servers that are belting out carbon emissions or energy intensive, then what does that mean for sustainability? Because you're putting this rapid turnover technology into what were long-lived infrastructures, and I wonder if that then actually accelerates the turnover of those longer-lived infrastructures. You know, your road systems and your cycle lanes and these sorts of things. So there are lots of, if you like, the nice thing with science and technology, I think, is it can raise these questions, it can interrogate the sort of assumptions and who's making certain framings about the way that we go about using technology and about the way who's involved in innovation, these kinds of questions. And just point out that there might be other ways of framing this, right. Other ways of doing technology, other ways of approaching innovation that might be more progressive in some way.
Now, during the workshop, one of the participants also had asked and raised, discourses, and asked about the different classes and the use of open data. Can you elaborate a little on how we might be able to learn from this type of project in thinking about including even more individuals into the democratization of the use of data?
This case study in Barcelona, there were a lot of really important themes in it, and I think by being a very concrete, practical example, it touched on some of these issues about democracy, about technocracy, about some of the assumptions about what technology does and what it does not. And so I ended up writing a piece for the Guardian newspaper to try and kind of use this to communicate some of these issues, and as a way of saying, look, here's a way of looking at these sorts of initiatives that raises questions of smart cities and what's being done to cities. And so and because it was a newspaper, I wanted to come up with a kind of catchy title. So the title of the piece was Smart Cities Need Thick Data, Not Big Data. So my approach, and it was very, not especially, it was simply looking at the way the data was helping this group to address the noise problem, if you like. I mean, so they'd done this noise monitoring campaign, and they'd generated some data about the noise. So that was it codified what they knew in a way that allowed that the city authorities would take note. Yeah, because now they could compare it with World Health Organization guidelines. They could compare it with what the scientific literature was saying about how noise levels affect our mental and physical health in various ways, depending on times of day and if they interrupt sleep, etc. And they could also compare it with other parts of the neighbourhood. And that's when they learned that the city authorities, as part of its smart city programs, had got this, it was called Centillo, and it had a noise monitoring network. And there was a noise monitorer in the square or right nearby that was generating open data, but no one knew about it. No one knew it existed in the square or what have you. Because I think for the city functionaries, as the authorities, it was just one data point in this network of sensors across the city, and they were looking at the city as this sort of operating system. But of course, for the residents, that data point and the sort of, if you like, the data they'd been generating was connected to life in the square and how it had been evolving and all the factors that had been making the square seem increasingly noisy. But also the point about the thick data kind of metaphor, if you like, was that in producing the data in this participatory way and this open way in the square, if you like, they'd been creating a collective, and it was connected to and associated with their concerns and their lives. We can argue whether, you know, what that means for the validity, if you like, and what have you, of the information they were producing and codifying. But so the idea that this data is becoming thick with social meaning, yeah, and it's thickening because we understand how it's being generated. So that picks up on something that the anthropologist Clifford Geertz said many, many years ago about thick description. And you can only really understand what's going on if you situate it in its context. You need to really understand what's happening in all its thickness. Whereas I think a lot of the way data's collected, abstracted, the way it moves, you could describe all of that in a very thick way. That's something science and technology studies, concepts and methods could do really, really well. But it's often not done. We just see this big data and we see these patterns and relations. But it's like, what are they telling us? You know, you need to kind of get back down into situations and contextualize them to understand them. So this data needs to become thick again with social meaning. And the data itself is not going to solve the problem of noise in the square either. You know, it doesn't work in and of itself. It has to be put to work. And the fact that it was generated in a participatory way meant that there was a collective produced that then also thought about, suggested measures to address the noise problem in the square. And then to, you know, press for those changes on the city authorities. The interesting thing, though, is also about the data, even thick data, if you like, is the limitations become evident as well, because some of the factors that are, some of the processes, if you like, some of the factors behind why the square's noisy are to do with the leisure economy in Barcelona, yeah, and the bars and restaurants, and that it's a place that's very attractive to tourists, and that has quite important economic value. So, and the sorts of conflicts there, if you like, as this square's become increasingly popular, and people go there to socialise and drink and what have you, and exercise quite important human rights to kind of gather and socialise publicly. But obviously, working out those conflicts and addressing some of these sort of structural issues around the way the city economy works in Barcelona.
You mentioned the community as one of these actors. What other types of participants have been supporting or played a role in your research? Any diverse participations that have amplified or elaborated on your research?
Well, I guess, many. We worked at the University of Sussex, where I work, and in the Science Policy Research Unit, we pride ourselves, and we try to live up to this principle of doing engaged research. So it's research with some purpose, some normative purpose. In my case, about trying to address sustainable development, so thinking about the roles that technology and innovation play in sustainable development. So some of the things I'll be talking about today, about frameworks for thinking about how quite entrenched, wide-scale socio-technical systems have transformed historically, and how we might take some of that understanding and use it in a more policy-oriented, proactive way. It's the sort of things we'll be talking about. And if you like, in doing that work in various sorts of projects, we've been working with not just policymakers, but civil society organisations as well. Some colleagues will be working with trade associations and what have you. And the point is to kind of get this ways of thinking out there and kind of create forums for seeing how some of these ways of thinking about large complex systems.
Now, did you have to connect with the government in order to be able to be inside of this community?
Well, the projects, I'm a contract researcher, so my job, if I don't win contracts, then, I'm not working as a researcher.
Okay.
So that's about, winning projects through open competitive calls, like any researcher, that come from, national science funding agencies or the European Union's, research programs, done bits of work for various organisations as well, like environmental organisations and things like that. But in terms of once you've kind of got a project funding and you're going with it and getting people involved, right. That's about just seeing, convening events or going and meeting them and doing activities that are meaningful for them and worthwhile, and that they will want to come and attend.
And were there police engagement as well?
Oh, do you mean in the case of Barcelona?
Exactly.
No. I was talking more generally, I think, because it's different for different projects. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And now to segue into the police subject, you mentioned that during the workshop that there was a bit of a police intervention or lack thereof. In terms of having data that has a life that goes far beyond political intent, and it sometimes loses control, especially with the police uses. Can you elaborate more on your experience during your project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the participants. We had a really interesting discussion, didn't we? I mean, that was the intent, if you like, and that was what's been really great about the workshop and coming here is learning. So, and that was also the intent. So here's an example. Here's some issues that it raises when we think about it, if you like, with a kind of science, technology studies sensibility. And then, so one of the things I mentioned in passing about this one example was, some of the proposals, if you like, for addressing the noise problem. Okay, so some people are proposing trying to change uses in the square, so the kind of socialising, what in Spain they call the botellón, was not as dominant, okay? It wasn't like they wanted to clear everybody from the square, the neighbours, they just wanted some sort of balance, if you like. So there were alternative uses proposed for the square. There was a proposal, and the council implemented, to install a playground, change some of the layout of the square. And then there were some people, thinking about, well, maybe just the police should just go in and fine people. And that was sort of not welcome as a suggestion by most people, as it was told to me by informants, okay, because it was seen to be a bit sort of heavy-handed. Though I think local police officers go around and just remind people to mind the noise and respect the neighbours. But then one of the participants pointed out how, I think it was in Rio they mentioned some research there where the police are using noise monitoring across the city to identify like noise hotspots, and that's where they'll send their patrol cars because to try and police parties and stuff that are going on in neighbourhoods and that may or may not be deemed to be oppressive, if you like. So again, there's all sorts of I don't know. So that might be an example of maybe a more authoritative use of technologies. Right. How kind of grassroots level people kind of develop technologies, appropriate technologies for their own purposes, or to try and produce sustainable developments in their own ways. So the other example I brought was a kind of something that was called the Lucas Plan, which was a kind of shop floor workers movement to promote socially useful production and to convert from arms manufacturing that arose in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was interesting because this movement also led to in London, the opening of community-based workshops where people would come in and prototype socially useful products. And the left-wing city authorities in that early 1980s period had policies and some limited funds to create industrial cooperatives and create some popularly planned economic activity in the city, including for manufacturing, which was suffering a decline and what have you. And so it was a really interesting initiative, and I don't know, I brought it, and I just wondered how this would have anything relevant. I mean, the UK's changed so much since then that you could ask whether this has got anything to say to the UK now. So to bring it over here to Quito, to see if it has anything to say, I thought would be kind of, I don't know, that's what it really tests this idea of contact zones and whether this sort of, this possibility for us to have dialogues across very different contexts was, how that would play out. And I was pleasantly surprised that people sort of resonated to it. I don't know if you felt yesterday. It was just it's just a really intriguing story, forgotten in large part in the UK and obviously elsewhere, but how that brought out themes as well about how people organise. If you like, I think the critical issue is because obviously some of these workshops that were opening in London in 1982, 1983 anticipate in intriguing ways this sort of explosion in the last decade of sort of maker spaces and this whole idea that we can, citizen innovation for prototyping things, and there's lots of really rich, interesting activity that has all sorts of possibilities, I think, in terms of democratizing technology, in terms of opening up the diversity, introducing diversity into prototyping capabilities. It can happen in growing numbers of places, organised well, and with really good community development practices behind it. It can get people involved who would never otherwise be involved in figuring out how can we use some of these technologies and devices. But, and this is the crucial thing that came from the example of the Lucas plan, and what people were saying about what's happening here in Quito with some of these sort of spaces, was, again, it comes back to context, It's what's going on kind of economically, politically, culturally. It's what's going on around these spaces that really actually structure the field of possibilities, if you like. So we talked a lot yesterday about opening up in Quito, just following the trend, and it happens in the UK as well. You get kind of economic development agencies and various public authorities saying, okay, we'll open up a innovation incubator or some co-working space, or fab labs or whatever, and some way that we haven't quite articulated, it will induce new businesses, work, and economic development. But what we were discussing yesterday is, well, a couple of things. It's like, that's okay, but actually we face so many crises now, crises of dignified work, crises of sustainable development, including climate change, crises of inequality, that this prototyping capability, socially speaking, ought to be oriented to addressing some of these issues, not just about contributing to economic development, business as usual. But we talked about, so the second point was how to do that, and it's about how, if you like, a programme for opening these sorts of spaces or promoting what some call inclusive innovation is, what's the best word here, is going to be highly restricted and maybe have limited impact unless you attend to some of these issues.
How can we then transfer these technological advances to more rural populations, for example, children, adolescents, and the elderly, who have their own language to innovate from an educational and community?
I think if you go up to, if we were to travel up to Colombia, there's a place called Minga Lab, which is a rural sort of space for looking at new technologies, and there are others as well. They're probably striking and notable because they stand out amidst others. But we talked yesterday about the way to do that is through positive discrimination, community development processes. Often we talked about how some of these incubators are about, there's some public money or even private corporate money to get a physical space, put some equipment in, and maybe have a technician running it. And there's never money for community development workers, social outreach programs. It's not just about kind of opening the door and waiting for people to come in, because the people who come in will be the ones who are already quite comfortable and associated with technologies and questions. You've got to kind of go out into neighbourhoods, and like you say, go out into the rural settings. And actually, I think also not just be technology boosters, or innovation cheerleaders. These ought to be spaces for really critical reflection. We talked a little bit yesterday about how some of these sort of like electronic repair initiatives, or there's an organisation called Restart Project based in London that organise really interesting electronics repair meetups with communities with a strong sense of kind of community development practices, and as well as getting, in a very practical way, people are welcome to come and learn how to fix some old radios that they treasure that don't work anymore. But it also opens up, in a practical way, to talk about some quite abstract things like, rights to repair, circular economy, how things are designed for production and not designed for repair. And also in an interesting way that if I or someone organised a public talk one evening about circular economy, I wonder how many people would turn up, or some people would, but if you like, that engages with people in a particular way, and this sort of more practical, let's enter in and do stuff, and then use that to start talking about really critical issues, and to critique technologies in some ways and the way they're done in societies at the moment. That's another mode, if you like, of engaging. It's really, really interesting. So taking these activities to rural settings, making sure that groups are involved who are otherwise excluded, has loads and loads of potential.
Okay.
But it also it needs to be meaningful to them. And it may be that, technology fixes aren't the thing. And the interesting thing is if you do this in a critical way, then you start to reveal the limitations, if you like, of innovations and technologies, and you see actually the only way these underlying issues around sustainability, inequality are going to be addressed is through deeper structural changes and political programs, not innovation incubators. But I still think it's interesting to think about what would happen. You may get those structural changes, but then there'll still be the context for doing innovation, for using technology or rejecting technologies, which technologies get rejected by societies, will change. And it's like, okay, well, what will it look like then if some of these structures facilitate much more democratic economic development? And what would technologies look like then? So, if you like, looking at these grassroots initiatives, even though they may be quite marginal in terms of power relations, they're intriguing spaces for doing things quite differently and anticipating, if you like, what might be possible. I'm really intrigued in understanding that and talking about that with whoever will listen.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's been a real privilege to have those sorts of discussions and dialogues and learn what's been going on here at the summer school in Quito, in Ecuador, in the region, and I'm keen to learn more.
We have so many viewers and listeners that are going to be just so honored to have you here and hear your discourse and your thoughts and the projects that you've done and your impact here in this country. Well, all right, great to have you in. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Gadis.
All the best to your travels and your future discourses. Thank you to the viewers and listeners. This is Gaudis Laxuri signing out.
Thanks.